For years, Stepan carried the weight of a past he barely understood. Abandoned as a child, he never imagined coming face to face with the woman who gave him life. But when fate brings him to a quiet garden at sunset, a single choice stands before him: forgiveness or the past forever lost. What will he decide? And can a mother's long-buried love mend the heart she once had to leave behind? Have you ever wondered what would happen if the past suddenly resurfaced? If a long-buried mystery knocked on your door one night, demanding an answer? Boris was making his way home through a thick, relentless rain. At 60, from a distance, he appeared to be a man accustomed to success, his posture upright, his features noble, his expensive suit a silent testament to his status. Yet beneath this impeccable facade lay a solitude no one could see. For 25 years, Boris had mourned his wife, Mila. She had died in an accident, and every week since, he had visited her grave, bringing a bouquet of white carnations, the flowers she had loved. As he walked, lost in thoughts of his impending visit to the cemetery, he suddenly noticed a dark silhouette at the other end of the street. A woman stood motionless in the downpour, clutching something tightly against her chest. At first, he intended to walk past her. When you have spent years imprisoned in your own grief, the pain of others ceases to affect you. But then he saw her eyes, filled with quiet, insistent desperation. "Please, help me," she murmured, her voice trembling, barely audible over the rain. Boris hesitated only for a moment before swiftly pulling several large bills from his pocket. "Take this. Find shelter," he said softly, trying to conceal his unease. The woman, Kira, clutched the money as if it were a lifeline. Then, almost in a whisper, she said, "Mila always told me there were good people in the world." At the mention of his wife's name, Boris felt a sharp pang in his chest. How could this woman possibly know Mila? Was it merely coincidence? He wanted to ask, but before he could, Kira disappeared into the crowd, leaving him alone with a question that echoed through the blinding downpour. The next morning, as he had done every week for years, Boris went to the cemetery. He never missed a visit to Mila's grave. He brought her favorite white flowers and sat in silence, as if hoping to hear her voice. But this time, something was different. As he approached the well-tended path, he noticed a familiar figure. Kira, the woman from the night before, was kneeling before Mila's tombstone, a baby wrapped in a thin blanket cradled in her arms. Boris moved closer, straining to hear her whispered words. "Thank you, Mila. Thank you for everything. I hope my son's life will be happier than mine," she murmured, a single tear falling onto the cold marble. Boris felt his heart tighten. How could this stranger be thanking his late wife? And for what? Summoning his courage, he softly called her name. Kira flinched in surprise. "What are you doing at my wife's grave?" he asked. Kira clutched the child protectively. "Your wife once saved my life," she whispered. Boris opened his mouth to ask another question, but before he could, Kira seemed to come to her senses. She stood abruptly and hurried away, as if afraid she had already said too much. Boris remained frozen in place, watching her disappear. For the first time in years, he felt Mila's presence, strong and near, as though she was still shaping the world around him, still leaving traces of herself behind. But why? That night, as he closed the heavy wooden door behind him, Boris took a deep breath and gazed at Mila's portrait on the wall. Her warm, familiar smile had once been his greatest joy. Now, it haunted him. Had Mila secretly been helping someone? Had she kept a part of her life hidden from him? And what did that child have to do with it? Seeking answers, Boris began searching through the letters and documents he had carefully preserved since Mila's death. He had accumulated a vast collection of papers, ties, and photographs, and at last, he recalled an old trunk tucked away in the far corner of the dressing room. It had been placed there shortly after Mila's death, untouched ever since. Among the photographs, one stood out, a young girl with a gentle smile, surrounded by others. It appeared to be taken at an orphanage. But what struck Boris the most was the inscription on the back, written in Mila's elegant handwriting, "For Kira's future." His heart pounded as he sifted through the pictures, until he discovered an aged, yellowed envelope containing a letter. Mila had addressed it to someone named Kira, offering words of reassurance, urging her to remember that even in the darkest moments, light could be found. "Kira," Boris murmured, a peculiar sensation stirring within him. What did all of this mean? He now knew, with certainty, that the connection between Mila and Kira ran far deeper than a fleeting acquaintance. But why had his wife never spoken to him about the orphanage she had taken under her wing? Lost in thought, Boris carefully placed the letter back inside the trunk and closed it. He had only uncovered a small fragment of the truth. Countless questions remained unanswered. Seated at his massive desk, he stared at the photograph and the letter, the silence of the mansion pressing in around him. The soft patter of raindrops against the window was the only sound. Mila had been here once, not so long ago. He could almost hear her quiet laughter, almost catch the faint trace of her perfume. But in reality, he was alone, consumed by thoughts of this mysterious Kira, the girl his wife had cared for so deeply. "Who are you, Kira?" Boris wondered, tracing a finger over the worn photograph. "And why didn't Mila share your story with me?" Realizing he wouldn't find the answers on his own, he reached for the phone. There was a man in Kotovo who could help. His old friend, Alexei, once his personal bodyguard, now a skilled private investigator, had a knack for uncovering hidden truths. "Alexei," Boris said when his friend answered. "Something has come up. I need to find out the truth about someone." "Go on," Alexei replied, his voice steady. "Do you remember how I told you about Mila's charity work?" "Of course. I found a name, Kira, and a letter with a photograph of her. It suggests that Mila helped her in some way, but I don't understand the details." Alexei promised to investigate immediately. As Boris ended the call, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a strange sense of urgency, as if solving this mystery was of profound importance. Rising from his chair, he approached Mila's portrait, gazing at her warm, familiar smile. Lowering his voice to a whisper, he murmured, "I never knew your secrets, Mila. But perhaps now, in your memory, I must uncover them." That night, sleep eluded Boris entirely. Standing on the threshold of something unknown, Boris waited. As dawn broke, he remained motionless, his gaze fixed on the phone, anticipating Alexei's call. Outside, the city stirred to life, yet within him, an unshakable feeling grew. Whatever Alexei had uncovered could change everything. At last, the phone rang. Alexei's voice, though tired, carried certainty. "Boris, you should come." "Where are you?" Boris asked, striving to keep his voice steady. "My office. But I haven't pieced everything together yet." Boris nodded, though Alexei couldn't see it, then swiftly gathered his things and called for a car. During the ride, his mind raced with possibilities. Had Alexei found Kira's name in orphanage records? Or perhaps in the reports from one of Mila's charity projects? Alexei's office, modest yet professional, was tucked away in the city center. Inside, he was waiting, surrounded by stacks of files and glowing computer screens. He gestured for Boris to sit before carefully sliding a folder across the desk. "I went through records from the shelters and charities where Mila volunteered. It seems she once helped a young woman named Kira secure a job at one of them," Alexei explained. Then, after a brief pause, he added, "There's also a mention that Kira may have been pregnant." Boris felt his chest tighten. A fragmented memory surfaced. Kira, standing in the rain, cradling a baby. "That's not all," Alexei continued. "I found an unusual adoption document with Kira's name. Mila's signature appears as a witness. It seems your wife played a significant role in the fate of this child." Boris clenched his fists, his mind struggling to assemble the pieces of a puzzle long buried. How long ago had this happened? Why had Mila never spoken of it? And, most importantly, why had Kira resurfaced in his life now? "I'll keep digging," Alexei assured him. "But one thing is clear, you and Kira are far more connected than you ever imagined." Boris stood, his pulse quickening. He was on the verge of uncovering the truth, but did he have the courage to face it? The revelation left him shaken. As he wandered the streets, the weight of Alexei's words pressed down on him. He scanned the passing faces, searching for Kira's among them, his thoughts a tangled mess of questions and half-formed realizations. At a traffic light, he hesitated, then, unable to resist, he dialed Victor's number. Victor had been Mila's driver for years. Perhaps he had seen something, heard something. "Victor, listen," Boris said when the call connected. "Remember that girl we saw in the rain? If you see her again, let me know immediately." That evening, as Boris sat at his desk, His phone vibrated with an unfamiliar number. He answered, and a hesitant, trembling voice came through. "I'm sorry for calling like this," Kira said. "I need to talk to you. I need to talk to you. I have no other choice." Boris's heart clenched. He couldn't be certain, but his intuition told him that the conversation ahead would change his understanding of the past. Without agreeing on a time or place, he simply replied, "Of course. I'm ready to listen." He knew this meeting would be like stepping into a dark room without a flashlight, yet he couldn't turn away. They arranged to meet in a secluded park, far from the noise of the city. When he arrived, he saw Kira wrapped in a coat, her fingers clutching the fabric tightly. A baby slept peacefully in a stroller beside her. The gray haze of the evening enveloped them, as if shielding them from prying eyes. "Thank you for coming," Kira whispered, her voice weak and exhausted. "I haven't slept in days, but I think we both need to understand what's happening." She took a deep breath, running a hand through her disheveled hair before pulling a crumpled envelope from her bag. It was worn, held together by rubber bands, as if its contents had been read countless times. "These letters were written to me," she said softly, trying to steady her voice. "It took me a long time to show them to you. Without her, I wouldn't even be here." Boris sat down beside her on the bench, his throat dry. He fought the urge to interrupt, instead choosing to listen. "Tell me," he urged gently. Kira closed her eyes for a moment, gathering her strength. "I was in an orphanage when I was 14. My father was abusive, and my mother left us and never came back. I had nowhere to go. Then Mila appeared. She reached out to me." She hesitated, gripping the envelope tighter. "I was pregnant, but no one at the orphanage wanted to help me. No one at the shelter cared. Mila was the only one who saw me, who truly heard me." The words caught in Kira's throat. She inhaled shakily before continuing. "And then she was gone, and my baby was taken away. I never knew who those people were, but I convinced myself he would be in good hands." A lump formed in Boris's throat as he pictured Mila, kind, compassionate, always deeply involved, hiding this secret. "You found out she was involved in the adoption?" he asked carefully. Kira nodded. "And yet, she never told me." She took a steadying breath. "That's why I wanted to show you these letters. You don't just need to know about Mila. You need to know about my son, who is probably still out there." She handed the envelope to Boris, her fingers trembling. Above them, dusk settled, the sky heavy with storm clouds, as if nature itself shared in the weight of this moment. Boris took the letters slowly, knowing they held a story far bigger than just Kira and Mila. They held his story, too. He thought back to the night he had found Kira, desperate, cold, clutching her baby in the rain. "That night, you asked for help," he murmured. Kira nodded. "My life is no fairy tale. The man I lived with, he was unbearable. He put his hands on me, and on the baby, even though he was the father." Boris stiffened. "I ran away to protect my son. I had nowhere to go, but thanks to you, I was able to rent a small room where we could be safe." Boris saw the raw pain in Kira's eyes. The weight of her past bore down on her, but so did the hope of something more. That night, he returned to his mansion much later than he had planned. As he ascended the grand staircase, he felt no exhaustion, only the whirlwind of thoughts that refused to settle. Kira, her son, Mila's secrets. The past was unraveling before him, piece by piece. But today, the quiet space of the house breathed differently. Boris sensed that something had changed in every corner, a silent yearning to understand rather than merely exist by habit. The dim glow of the table lamp caught the edge of an old portrait of Mila as Boris placed the stroller filled with papers in the corner. Among them, he noticed a familiar signature, Mila's. The first letter was the shortest. In it, she wrote about her belief in the power of kindness and promised to be there, no matter what. Boris's heart clenched. Her voice seemed to come alive through the ink on the page. Slowly, he turned to the next letter. "Dear Kira, I know you're scared right now, but believe me, even in the darkest place, there is always a glimmer of light. Don't be afraid to be strong." Mila's words, written so many years ago, suddenly felt as though they were meant not only for Kira but for Boris himself. 1,000 questions swirled in his mind. Had he and Mila stopped trusting each other? Or had she simply chosen to shoulder the burdens of others on her own, sparing him while he remained consumed by his own affairs? Carefully, Boris picked up a faded letter and a black and white photograph of Mila holding the hand of a much younger Kira, a girl about the same age as Che-Ilip had been. In the background, shelter staff struggled to keep hold of an energetic dog on a leash. Kira's eyes, however, held a different kind of unrest, a quiet anxiety that Boris had never before suspected. The fog in his mind began to lift as he recalled Alexei's words. Mila had not just been a volunteer. She had likely been involved in the adoption of Kira's child. But where was the child now? And why had Mila kept this from him? The sudden ring of the phone shattered his thoughts. Alexei's voice came through, tense but resolute. "I found something on the adoption records. You need to see it in person." Boris felt his pulse quicken. His eyes flicked instinctively to the photograph of Mila and Kira, and in a half-whisper, he replied, "All right, I'll be there right away." Hanging up, he realized his hands were trembling, not with fear, but with urgency. It was as if, for the first time, the clouds of the past were about to clear, revealing the long-hidden truth. If Mila had made a promise to Kira, then he owed it to both of them to uncover what had happened to the child. Tucking the letters carefully back into the envelope, Boris left the office, barely aware of his own heartbeat echoing against the rain-streaked windows. Outside, heavy storm clouds loomed over the city, thick with the weight of an impending revelation. By dusk, Boris stood outside an inconspicuous office building, Alexei's workspace. The city's skyline was shrouded in darkness, rain cascading down the glass door. Inside, the glow of flickering monitors illuminated stacks of folders and an array of computers. Alexei's office was a peculiar blend of stark metal cabinets and disheveled cardboard boxes overflowing with old reports. It was clear that he worked not for appearances, but for the substance of the truth itself. "You're still working on it?" Boris asked, glancing at the scattered papers on the desk. Alexei wordlessly held out a set of stapled sheets. "This is a copy of an archived document. I've been trying to retrieve it from the databases for a week." Boris took the pages and scanned them, his breath catching as his eyes landed on a single name. "Look who signed as a witness," Alexei murmured. As a witness, Boris carefully took the folder and began reading the name. Adopted by the biological mother. Kira's last name had been erased. The timeline coincided with the period when Mila had disappeared for a while, only to return home exhausted and, as it seemed to Boris, more withdrawn. At the time, he hadn't given it much thought, attributing her state to mere fatigue. He had been focused solely on the legal cases connected to his wife's charitable programs. Boris put down the documents. Clearly, the child had been placed in an orphanage and later adopted by a family from another region, the Sadovs. However, both adoptive parents had passed away a few years ago. What had become of the boy after their deaths remained an open question. A flicker of hope, tinged with apprehension, stirred within Boris. The child could have grown up anywhere, even in the same town. And yet, he had never imagined that, all this time, someone had been pulling invisible strings behind his back. "So, we have an anonymous archive in Kira's almost erased surname," Boris summarized. "But this seems to be a direct lead, one that could finally connect us to the missing child." His resolve solidified. With a steady hand, he passed the documents to Alexei, as if handing over a symbolic key. "It's time to act," he said firmly. "If we find this boy, now a man, maybe we can finally answer the questions that have haunted both me and Kira." He stood up, surveying the cluttered workspace. The air carried the scent of old paper and coffee, the smell of a pursuit, like something out of a detective novel. Mila's final words echoed in his mind. "Even in the darkest corners, there is always a glimmer of light." Outside the office, Alexei shook Boris's hand and bid him farewell. "As soon as there's news, don't you dare ignore my call. The answers might be closer than we think." The rain had begun to fall again, a rhythmic whisper against the pavement. Boris exhaled deeply, something shifting inside him. Maybe fate wasn't as cruel as he had once believed. Maybe the past hadn't returned to torment him, but to offer him a second chance. The next morning, Boris awoke earlier than usual. The sky outside was a dull gray, and the remnants of the night's chill still lingered in the air. His mind, however, was restless, weaving together fragments of memories, Mila, Kira, and the child she had once tried to protect. He poured himself a cup of coffee and stepped into his study, eyes drawn to Mila's portrait. Each passing day, he felt her presence more keenly, as if she were invisibly guiding him. "Why did you keep this from me?" he thought, not with resentment, but with an ache of understanding. Mila had always wanted to protect others from unnecessary pain. Then, his phone rang. It was Kira. "Boris, I've been thinking," she said, her voice tinged with urgency. "There was a woman who worked at the orphanage back then, Nadezhda Petrovna. If we can find her, she might remember something." After a brief conversation, Boris quickly gathered his things and called Alexei. "We have another lead, Nadezhda Petrovna, a former employee of the shelter. She might know something crucial." Alexei responded without hesitation. "Perfect. Send me whatever details you have. I'll try to track her down through old records and contacts." As Boris hung up, a spark of determination ignited within him. Perhaps they were already halfway to piecing the puzzle together. Somewhere between the lines of old documents, Kira's voice, and Mila's letters, an undeniable truth emerged. Kindness is stronger than time, and the past was returning, not to haunt them, but to find its way into the light. Now, only one question remained. Who could finally reveal the fate of the missing child? Boris placed his now-cold coffee on the table. One thing was certain, he would not stop until he uncovered the truth. A truth that could reunite scattered lives and offer them a long-overdue chance to heal. For the first time in years, Boris felt truly alive. He suddenly recalled that Kira might have had a friend from the orphanage. Desperate for answers, he set his sights on finding a certain Nadezhda Petrovna, who could potentially shed light on the past, on Mila, Kira, and the enigmatic circumstances surrounding them. According to Kira, Nadezhda Petrovna was an elderly woman who had once overseen much of the orphanage's operations. She handled paperwork, maintained records, and managed the caretakers. But more than 25 years had passed since then. Where could she be now? Wasting no time, Boris called Alexei. "Have you found anything?" he asked impatiently the moment his friend answered. "I think her last name is Ushakova," Alexei replied, pausing to check his notes. "The search is proving difficult. Officially, the orphanage was shut down long ago, and most of the staff moved away. But I did find a clue. She might still be living in one of the old houses on the outskirts of town. I came across an address for her a few months ago." Boris looked at the slip of paper in his hands and realized they were trembling slightly. "I'll go see her myself," he said decisively. That evening, Boris found himself standing in front of a small, paneled house in a quiet residential district. The dim streetlights flickered weakly, as though they could go out at any moment. Near the entrance, a group of elderly women huddled together, eyeing him curiously. His expensive car and formal suit stood out in the modest neighborhood. "Who are you here to see, young man?" one of them asked, adjusting the knitted shawl on her shoulders, her eyes twinkling with amusement at Boris's slightly flustered smile. "Nadezhda Petrovna Ushakova," he replied. The woman tilted her head, scrutinizing him as if deciding whether to reveal a well-guarded secret. "She lives on the 3rd floor, apartment 12, she finally said, her voice softening. "But be quiet, she's been ill lately." Boris nodded in thanks and climbed the narrow staircase. Upon reaching the door, he noticed a crooked piece of cardboard bearing the number 12. He pressed the doorbell, his heart pounding. The silence stretched unbearably. Then, the sound of bolts shuffling. The door opened slightly, revealing a woman in her 70s, her thin gray hair framing a sharp, observant gaze. "Yes, that's me. What do you want?" she asked warily. Boris took a deep breath, steadying himself. "I'm looking for information about the orphanage you once managed," he began. "My name is Boris, and He hesitated, struggling to condense years of emotion and unanswered questions into a single sentence. "It's about Kira," he finally said. "You might remember her, a teenage girl who had a difficult family situation, and the adoption of her child. My wife, Mila, helped her." Nadezhda's expression flickered with recognition. "Yes, I remember her. And Kira, too. But it was so long ago. Do you really think I can tell you anything useful?" "Every detail matters," Boris insisted, trying to keep his voice steady. "I have to find out the truth, not just for myself, but for Kira. And for Mila's memory." At the mention of Mila's name, something shifted in Nadezhda's eyes. Mila Zalza Petrovna suddenly remembered something important. She remained silent for a moment before stepping aside to let him in. "Come in. I hope I still have some tea left," she said. "Tell me what you want to know, and if my memory serves me well, I will help you in any way I can." The air carried the scent of old books and faint traces of medicine. The apartment was small but cozy. She settled into a chair while Boris took in his surroundings. A teapot and a few cups sat on a nearby table. Adjusting the sleeve of her knitted sweater, she looked at him thoughtfully. "Where shall we begin? Tell me, and I will try to remember." Boris gazed at her with deep gratitude. He realized that, despite being completely different people, this woman could hold the key to unlocking the truth. "Let's start with the most important part," he said. "What can you tell me about Kira, her son, and how my wife, Mila, became involved?" Nadezhda Petrovna furrowed her brow, sifting through her memories. Boris sensed that he was about to get closer to the answers that had kept him restless for the past day. Wrapping herself in a warm shawl, she looked at him intently. Boris leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table, waiting for her words. The air was thick with tension, laced with the slightly bitter aroma of tea. She finally spoke, her gaze fixed on her cup. "It was a difficult case," she began. "Kira ended up on the streets because of the appalling conditions at home. She was only 14 or 15 years old and already pregnant. No one wanted to take responsibility for her. Our orphanage was overcrowded as it was." She fell silent, lost in thought, recalling every detail of the past. Boris waited patiently, careful not to interrupt. And then Mila arrived. Nadezhda Petrovna continued, a small smile forming as warmth returned to her eyes. She was determined to help Kira. What amazed me most was how, against all odds, she managed to find both a place and the resources for her. Mila went to her superiors, secured funding, negotiated with doctors, and even arranged free counseling for the girl. Without her, I fear Kira would have been lost to the streets. "And the baby?" Boris asked softly. "A boy," Nadezhda Petrovna replied. "A calm, beautiful baby boy. But the orphanage couldn't keep him. We simply weren't equipped for that. Kira soon realized she couldn't raise him alone. That's when Mila found a family who had longed for a child to adopt, the Sadovs." "Kira agreed to the adoption?" Boris asked. "Yes," she nodded. "Mila handled everything. She even signed the documents as a witness." Boris felt as though a page was turning in his soul, the past becoming clearer. The boy had been given a chance at a normal life. But then Kira disappeared. Nadezhda Petrovna murmured, "If it hadn't been for Mila, I don't know what would have happened to her." And then, she hesitated, her fingers tightening around the cup's handle. "We heard of Mila's passing. From that moment on, all communication was lost." Silence fell over the room, broken only by the faint ticking of a clock. Boris pressed his palms together, lost in thought. Fragments of the past pieced themselves together. Mila's kindness toward Kira, the way she had ensured the boy's adoption, and the lingering question of why it had all unfolded the way it did. One question remained. He tried to steady his voice as he asked, "What happened to that child when the Sadovs?" "I'm afraid I can't be of much help here," the woman replied. "But perhaps there are still people who know something. If the Sadovs moved back to town, you might be able to find traces of them." Boris could feel the weight of urgency pressing down on him, the need to finally complete what had begun so long ago. By the end of the evening, he was already in his car, scrolling through his phone, caught in a strange mix of gratitude and unease. The old woman's words seemed to weave together the scattered pieces of the puzzle: Kira, the helpless young mother, and Mila, the woman who had once carried the weight of this responsibility. And at the very heart of it all was the boy, the child entrusted to the Sadovs, who might just be the missing link that no one dared to speak of. His phone rang. Seeing Alexei's name on the display, Boris answered immediately. "Did you find something?" "Yes." Alexei's voice was tinged with excitement, though measured. "I got a tip-off. Remember how I said I'd check the databases? Well, I found a record of the boy who was adopted by the Sadovs. He's registered in our town." Boris's grip on the phone tightened. "Are you sure?" Alexei hesitated only a moment. "Pretty sure. He works for a major tech company now. Probably moved closer to the center." "Name?" "Stepan. Last name, that's tricky. It looks like he changed it after the Sadovs passed away. I'm still digging." For a moment, Boris was speechless. Just today, he had uncovered the truth, how this boy had once been plucked from a harsh orphanage and given a second chance. And now, he was a grown man, living his own life, completely unaware of the people who had once fought for him. "What are you going to do?" Alexei's voice dropped slightly, as if sensing the gravity of the moment. "Find me his exact address or contacts," Boris replied without hesitation. "I need to talk to him." As he ended the call, Boris gazed out the car window, the city unfolding before him in a blur of neon reflections and towering silhouettes. Unease settled in his chest. For Kira and Stepan, this meeting would be more than just a conversation, it would be a reckoning. And for Boris himself, it would mean stepping out of the armor of his usual restraint. Yet, beneath his apprehension, a thought flickered. Even the smallest ray of light can pierce the deepest darkness. "I hope I'm doing the right thing," he murmured. The car pulled up in front of his house. As Boris stepped out, the cold night air stung his face. Crossing the threshold, an image flashed before his eyes: Kira, young and fragile, holding her baby close. So many years had passed. And yet, all this time, even in death, Mila had remained an invisible guide, silently leading them forward. He didn't know what he would say when he finally stood before Stepan, but he knew one thing: it was time to lay the past to rest. And, perhaps, to give Kira the closure she had never found. This realization, though daunting, filled him with a quiet, unwavering resolve. Twilight was settling over the city as Boris stepped onto the terrace of his mansion. The warm glow of the evening lights contrasted with the weight of Alexei's discovery. If the young man named Stepan was indeed that child, now an adult, what guarantee was there that he would even want to speak to strangers? And how could they explain to him that this wasn't just some obscure secret, but a crucial piece of his own past? Boris hesitated, tempted to call Kira and share the news. Yet, he knew it was too soon. Better to wait for Alexei's confirmation, for a precise address, a solid lead. His hand reached for the phone, but before he could dial, it vibrated with an incoming call. "I found something," Alexei's voice came through, steady but urgent. "Your Stepan is only 24. After his adoptive parents passed away, he moved from the suburbs to the city center. Seems like he never tried to find his biological relatives." Boris felt a surge of anticipation. Yes, about 6 months ago, he rented a room in a shared apartment on Pervomeyskaya Street. His landlady says he's a quiet, polite guy, always working late. His name is still Stepan, as we thought, but he changed his surname. He goes by Veselov now. Boris tightened his grip on the terrace railing. Veselov. How had time and fate reshaped this young man's life, weaving him unknowingly into the stories of so many others? "I need to speak with him," Boris said at last. "But I don't know how to approach him." "Give me some time," Alexei replied. "I'll try to find out his schedule, see when he's home, so we don't catch him off guard." That evening, Boris found himself lost in thought. Closing his eyes, he tried to conjure an image of Stepan, a tall figure, perhaps, or of average height. Surely, he had his own life, his own routines, friends, ambitions. And then, out of nowhere, a stranger would appear and say, "Hello, I have a secret about your birth. The woman who once helped you, she was my wife." Boris exhaled slowly. He had no right to keep silent. Kira deserved to meet the son she had once given away, still just a teenager herself at the time. Mila had wanted a better future for them all. But how could they reveal the truth without unraveling everything Stepan had built over 24 years? The city lights flickered against the darkening sky, reflections dancing in the rippling horizon. And yet, there was something reassuring in their quiet glow, perhaps even a sign that this meeting was meant to happen. The next morning, amidst the routine paperwork of his company, Boris found his thoughts drifting back to Stepan. How do you approach someone whose entire past is about to change? His phone rang, breaking the silence. "I spoke to the landlady," Alexei reported. "Stepan usually gets home around 8 p.m. On Saturdays, if he's not working, he likes to go for a walk in the nearest public garden. She says he enjoys reading, mostly technical articles." Boris closed his eyes, picturing a young man sitting alone on a park bench, lost in his book. An unexpected tenderness stirred within him, as though he already felt a connection to this stranger. And now, the eternal question: how do I reach him? Alexei waited for Boris's answer. Alexei waited impatiently. After a brief silence, he finally spoke. I think it's best to proceed without any sudden moves. Approach him as a potential employee. Acknowledge his talents. He works at a technology company, so strike up a conversation, gauge his openness. Then, perhaps, you can ease into your personal reasons for seeking him out. Boris nodded in understanding. This approach would be far less of a shock to Stepan's psyche than abruptly confronting him with the full truth. The entire story, especially the long-standing tragedy and Mila's role in it, needed to be told carefully and only if the young man was willing to listen. What days does he come to this park? Boris asked. I'll try to arrange a chance encounter. After hanging up, he felt a mix of tension and quiet determination pressing against his chest. From the corridor, a soft knock interrupted his thoughts. The secretary stepped in. Sorry to disturb you, but there's a young woman here to see you. Her name is Kira. She says you were expecting her. Kira is here. Boris lifted his gaze from his phone. Ask her to wait in the living room. I'll be right there. When he entered the room, he saw Kira standing by the large panoramic window. In the daylight, she looked even more fragile and exhausted than usual, but her eyes held something deeper, a quiet strength. In her arms, she cradled her baby, who had dozed off. Hello, she said, turning to him with a timid smile. I didn't want to interrupt, but I couldn't wait any longer. Is there any news? Boris hesitated for a moment before speaking. Perhaps, he said quietly. I think we've found him, but for now, it's just a possibility. A mix of fear and hope flickered across Kira's face. Do you think he'll agree to meet me? Boris stepped closer and gently placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. I can't guarantee how things will go, but I'll do everything in my power to make this work, step by step. I want to see Stepan first, to understand what kind of life he's built, to confirm the details. Kira's voice trembled. And if he doesn't want to see me? Boris shook his head. No one knows what's in his heart. But I believe, once he learns what it cost you and how much you've cared for him all these years, he'll understand. Her baby stirred in her arms, as if sensing the weight of the conversation. I'll let you know as soon as I meet him, Boris assured her, doing his best to sound confident. For now, we'll need patience. But we've already taken the first major step. Kira met his gaze with quiet gratitude. At last, they were on the path to uncovering the truth, a truth that would bring clarity not just to Stepan, but to all of them. Saturday arrived, bringing a cloudy, cool morning. A light drizzle had been falling since dawn, but by noon, the rain had cleared, leaving damp paths and passers-by wrapped in light coats. Dressed more casually than usual, jeans, a dark jacket, an umbrella in hand, Boris walked toward Pervomeyskaya Square. It felt as though he were heading into the most significant meeting of his life. Yet, unlike a business negotiation, there were no contracts, no formalities, only uncertainty. And he didn't even know what Stepan looked like. Alexei wandered past the benches, subtly backing up Boris while observing the few people around. Soon, he noticed a young man, about 22 years old, tall, slender, with short dark hair, sitting on a bench with an e-reader on his lap. Stepan Veselov appeared engrossed in his reading, seemingly unaware of his surroundings. Boris took a deep breath, feeling his mouth go dry. Pretending to notice Stepan by chance, he approached and asked in a neutral tone, "Excuse me, could you tell me where the nearest coffee shop is?" Stepan looked up and offered a polite smile. "Just around the corner, about 100 meters ahead. There's a small place there, not bad, and they do takeout." Boris nodded, as if considering the suggestion. "Thanks. Do you come here often?" Stepan shifted slightly on the bench. "Only on weekends, if I don't have urgent work. I like to take a break from the office." He hesitated briefly before adding, as if apologizing for his profession, "I work in IT." Boris took note of the confidence and ease in Stepan's voice. He didn't seem like someone burdened by his past. On the contrary, he appeared composed, grounded. That was a promising sign. It meant the revelation about his biological background might not be a devastating blow. "I hope I'm not catching you off guard," Boris said carefully. "I'm working on a project related to IT, and I've heard you have valuable experience. If you're interested, give me a call." He handed over a business card. Stepan glanced at it, raising his eyebrows slightly as he recognized the familiar name of an influential businessman. Yet, he remained reserved, responding only with a brief nod. Boris took that as a good sign. At least the first step had been taken. Not wanting to overstay his welcome, Boris said his goodbyes and slowly walked toward the exit of the square, making a conscious effort not to look back, so as not to appear intrusive. Around the corner, Alexei caught up with him. "Well, he seems happy," Boris exhaled. "I'm glad for him, but whether he reaches out, well, that's another matter." "Let's hope he calls," Alexei replied. A quiet but restrained sense of joy settled over Boris. That brief meeting had given him confidence. Stepan was open, not fearful of new things. Perhaps this would be easier than he had imagined. And then, one evening, his phone rang. The caller ID displayed an unfamiliar number. "Hello? Boris? This is Stepan. We met in the park the other day." Boris felt a wave of relief. "I'm glad you called. I hope my interest in your skills didn't come across as strange." Stepan responded politely, though with a hint of caution. "I did some research on you. You're quite a major figure in the business world. If your offer is real, I'd be open to discussing the details." There was a touch of skepticism in his voice, but also curiosity. Boris suggested meeting at a cafe near Stepan's office. That evening, Boris arrived early and chose a secluded table. As he waited, he scrolled through his phone, rereading one of Mila's old letters. The words weighed on him, a quiet reminder of the past. Soon, Stepan arrived. He took off his light jacket, sat down, and leaned back into his chair, his expression composed yet expectant. Sitting across from Boris, Stepan tried to maintain a composed demeanor. "Thank you for your time," he said. Boris nodded and began outlining a vague, fictitious project, nothing concrete, just general ideas about developing technological solutions. "I must admit, we have a connection through mutual acquaintances, though it's a long story," Boris added. Stepan frowned slightly. "I don't recall. Perhaps one day. I'll share the details," Boris replied evasively. "For now, let's focus on work. I need to understand the direction you'd like to take." Stepan joined the discussion, speaking about programming and how he was entirely self-taught. Boris listened, but his mind was elsewhere. Would he be able to say it out loud? To reveal that Stepan was the very boy Mila had helped save 25 years ago? As they settled the bill and prepared to leave, Boris finally summoned the courage. "You know, Stepan, I have a personal question, unrelated to work." Stepan paused, wallet in hand, and looked at him cautiously. "Have you ever thought about your biological parents?" Stepan stiffened. "How do you know I'm adopted?" His tone was wary. "I don't like to talk about it." Boris felt a knot tighten in his chest. Perhaps he had rushed into this, but he couldn't leave it unresolved. "I'm sorry for being so direct," Boris said carefully. I have information that might be important to you, but only if you want to know." Stepan crossed his arms, clearly unsettled. "My adoptive parents were wonderful people. It's a shame they're gone now, but I've never searched for my biological family. Why dig up the past?" Boris felt cornered again. How could he explain that the past was already encroaching on Stepan's life? That somewhere, there was a mother who had spent years grieving his loss? But he realized he wasn't ready, not yet. This wasn't his truth to force upon Stepan. "You're right," Boris admitted quietly. "I won't lie, I do know something, but I don't want to overwhelm or hurt you. If you ever want to talk about your origins, call me. I'll answer any questions you have." Stepan tensed, but Boris saw no anger in his eyes, only fear and uncertainty. "I'll think about it," Stepan murmured before quickly leaving Boris alone with the weight of what he had just done. He had opened a door leading to a buried truth, but was Stepan ready to step through it? The next day, Boris called Kira to recount the meeting. He chose his words carefully. "And? He's not ready yet, is he?" Kira asked. There was a quiet sadness in her voice. "I don't think so, but there's a chance," Boris replied. "He's rational, not closed off. He just doesn't want his life disrupted overnight." "I've lived in fear for years," Kira admitted. "Afraid that my own son would hate me. But the truth is, he doesn't even know me." Boris felt his heart tighten with compassion. "Between hating you and never knowing you," he said softly, "I think the second might be even harder to bear. He will forget, or perhaps the distance will make him do so. But in either case, the pain remains. Let's give him time, Boris suggested gently. I believe fate has brought us together for a reason. When he makes his decision, we'll be ready. He tried to distract himself, but every ring of the phone made his heart race. He wanted Stepan to call. He wanted to tell him about Mila, about her kindness, about the struggle she endured to ensure that, long ago, a little boy found a new home. A foster home, yes, but a loving one. Stepan finally called in the evening, just as Boris was about to leave the office. I've been thinking it over, Stepan said slowly, carefully choosing his words. Maybe I do need to learn about my roots. When can we meet? Boris felt an immense weight lift from his chest. Whenever you're ready. Even now, or tomorrow, if that's more convenient for you. I can come to you. Let's do it today, Stepan answered, his voice restrained but firm. It's better to face it now, otherwise, I'll keep postponing it again. They met at the same cafe where they had spoken recently. This time, Stepan looked tense but prepared. Boris could sense the gravity of the moment, the weight of long-buried truths about to surface. I don't know what you're going to tell me, Stepan admitted, settling into the chair across from Boris. But since you're so certain it concerns me, I'm listening. Boris nodded briefly, steeling himself. He took a deep breath and began the story that would change everything. As he spoke, Stepan's eyes widened. The details aligned too perfectly to be a coincidence. So you're saying, Stepan murmured, turning a paper napkin between his fingers as if searching for a way to process it all. Why are you telling me this? Why now? Boris inhaled deeply, a shiver running through him. He knew he had to tell the truth. I'm not just some random person, he confessed. I'm the husband of the woman who saved your mother. Mila passed away a long time ago, but somehow, she keeps bringing us together through time. And Kira, your mother, she has always wanted to know how you are. She has always wondered if you would ever want to see her. Stepan closed his eyes, overwhelmed by the flood of revelations. Confusion, fear, curiosity, and an internal battle played out in his expression. I always thought my biological parents either died or abandoned me, he admitted, his voice unsteady. But this is more complicated than I ever imagined. Kira never stopped searching for you, Boris said quietly. She didn't have the resources, the means to fight through the bureaucratic barriers. She was just a scared young girl when Mila saved her. Life was never easy for her, but through it all, she never stopped believing you were out there, that you were hers. Stepan exhaled sharply, rubbing his forehead as if to steady himself. Now I have to decide if I want to meet her, he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Suddenly, my whole life feels. He trailed off. Boris didn't push. He simply nodded. Take your time, he assured him. No one is pressuring you to decide this second. But you should know, Kira asks for nothing except the chance to tell you she's sorry, and that she has loved you all these years. Stepan stood up abruptly, sweat beading on his forehead. He hesitated, glancing at Boris as if searching for something, reassurance, perhaps. Then, with a deep breath, he exhaled. I'll be in touch, he said before walking away, leaving Boris to wonder if the past had finally begun to mend itself. Boris realized there was nothing more to say. He shook Stepan's hand and watched him walk to the door, feeling as though they had traversed a long journey in just a few brief conversations. Now, the hardest part remained, giving Stepan the space to make his own choice. Not wanting to pressure him, Boris refrained from calling unnecessarily. He knew Stepan needed time to process such a weighty decision. Meeting his biological mother would not only challenge his perception of the past, but also stir emotions he might not yet be ready to confront. Then, on an otherwise ordinary day, Boris's phone rang. Stepan's voice was calm, steady. I want to see her. Can you arrange a meeting? Boris felt his heart tighten, but he responded with measured composure. Of course. Tell me where it's most convenient for you, and I'll take care of everything. They agreed to meet in a secluded city garden, lush with greenery, in the evening when the sun would be setting, casting golden hues along the winding paths. Kira was the first to arrive, visibly more anxious than usual. She absently toyed with the edge of her scarf, her nervous energy betraying her anticipation. In the stroller beside her, her baby slept peacefully. Boris stood nearby, a quiet pillar of support. He'll be here soon, he murmured, resting a reassuring hand on her shoulder. The minutes stretched unbearably, each second drawn out by the weight of expectation. Then, at last, a figure emerged from the shadows of the alley, Stepan. His approach was hesitant, his steps alternating between measured and hurried, betraying his inner turmoil. As he neared the bench where Kira sat, Boris discreetly stepped aside, giving them the privacy they needed. Stepan halted just a step away from her, his gaze locking onto hers. Their eyes brimmed with unshed tears. Kira clutched her hands to her chest as if steadying herself, her entire being focused on the son she had lost and found again. It was Stepan who finally broke the silence. "Hello. I don't even know what to call you." Kira's lips trembled. "I understand," she whispered. "You can call me whatever feels right. I'm not expecting you to say Mom. I know that may not feel natural to you. But, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry that I couldn't be there for you." Her voice faltered, the weight of unspoken years pressing upon her. Stepan closed his eyes and drew a slow, measured breath. "I don't know if I can forgive you. Not yet. But I want to understand." So she told him. She spoke of her youth, of the fear that had paralyzed her, of the harsh reality that she had been too young, too powerless to protect him. She explained how she had done everything in her power to ensure he didn't end up on the streets, how every day since, she had wondered if he was alive, if he had been happy. With each word, Stepan's face paled. His hands clenched, his jaw tightened, as though bracing himself against emotions he hadn't realized were buried so deep. "Mila," he murmured, barely above a whisper. "That was her name, wasn't it? Boris's wife. She saved your life." Kira nodded, following his gaze toward Boris, who had withdrawn slightly to give them space, yet remained close enough should he be needed. Her voice broke as she finally spoke the words that had been waiting all these years. "I'm grateful to her. And to you." Kira spoke softly. "Because of you, I find the strength to keep going. Most importantly, I realize that not everything is lost." In the silence that followed, a faint squeak came from the baby in the stroller. Stepan shifted his gaze, his expression uncertain. "I named him Amal," Kira continued, "in honor of hope, the hope that one day, things will get better." Stepan leaned over the stroller, looking at the baby, whose innocent eyes held boundless trust in the world. Suddenly, a warm, genuine smile spread across his face. For the first time, he felt as though he was part of something greater than just his own story. "So small and fragile," he whispered. "I was this tiny once." Kira nodded. "Yes, very tiny. But believe me, I never stopped thinking about you." Her words seemed to break through the wall between them. Finally, Stepan stepped forward and embraced Kira, a simple yet profound gesture. She wept quietly against his chest. From a short distance, Boris watched, overcome with gratitude toward Mila. Even though she was gone, she had given him yet another gift, this moment of reunion. "Thank you," Stepan murmured. "I don't know what the future holds, but I'm glad I finally learned the truth." Boris smiled. "Don't thank me. It was all Mila. I only continued what she once started." As twilight deepened in the quiet city garden, the three of them stood together. The past, which had long remained buried in pain and secrecy, had now found its place, not in sorrow, but in forgiveness and hope for the future. At that moment, Boris felt something shift within himself, a quiet liberation. He could almost hear Mila's gentle voice. "I always knew that kindness is stronger than any obstacle." Maybe that was why life had given him this second chance, to help reunite those who had once been torn apart. Tears welled in Stepan's eyes, but they were no longer tears of despair. They were tears of relief, of newfound hope. As he gazed at the baby in the stroller, he smiled, innocently, like a child, perhaps not yet fully aware of the long road ahead. But the hardest step had already been taken. Together, under the last golden rays of the setting sun, they stood in quiet triumph over fear, over pain. And in that stillness, Boris understood something profound. The past never truly disappears. It can return to break us, but it can also heal us, if we dare to open our hearts and believe that a single act of kindness can change a life. Thank you for joining our journey. Which part of this story moved you the most? Do you believe that love and kindness can overcome the wounds of the past, no matter how many years have passed? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, Leave a like and subscribe to our channel for more heartfelt stories. And don't forget to share this video with your loved ones. Perhaps it will inspire them to do something truly meaningful.